I hope this message reaches you securely. I'm using my personal encrypted email because I can't risk this being traced on the official network. Please bear with me. This is going to sound unbelievable, but I swear on my honor it's true. Someone outside this environment needs to know what's happening here at Fort Knox. Fort Knox is known for being locked down tighter than anywhere. The vault building itself is a squat fortress of granite and concrete, with a 20-ton blast-proof door and layers of security. We've got fences on top of fences, some electrified landmines rumored in the surrounding field. I read that somewhere and wasn't sure to believe it, but I wouldn't be surprised. And armed guards everywhere. On paper, I'm just a cog in the machine here, one of thousands of soldiers on post, about 40,000 including families, effectively a small city of its own. My job involves routine security patrols and monitoring sensors around sensitive areas. I have a secret clearance due to the nature of the installation, and I thought I was privy to how this place operates. But what I stumbled onto wasn't in any SOP or briefing I ever saw. It started a few weeks ago during a graveyard shift. I was on a routine perimeter patrol near the bullion depository, that iconic vault building. Usually, my nights are uneventful, checking fence integrity, verifying that alarms and motion sensors are all functional, and keeping an eye on the surveillance feeds. We occasionally get false alarms, deer wandering too close or a wild turkey setting off a motion sensor. We're trained to respond by the book, follow the row, rules of engagement, call it in, sweep the area with another MP. Nothing ever comes of it. But that night, I noticed something off. A convoy of 2 unmarked trucks driving across the base at around 2 o'clock, lights off, moving in the direction of the vault. That was unusual. All movements on post are logged, and late-night deliveries are almost non-existent, especially toward the bullion depository, which is treasury-run and not usually active at night. Our chain of command hadn't briefed us about any transfer. Curiosity got the better of me. I kept my distance and followed, radioing in a generic status update so they'd think I was at a different checkpoint. Yes, I bent a few rules, but I did it anyway. The trucks headed not to the vault's main entrance, but to a lesser-known back gate near the hillside. There's an old service road there that I thought led to some maintenance sheds. To my surprise, the vehicles passed through an automated gate after a quick biometric scan. I've been on Knox for a couple of years and didn't even know that gate had a biometric reader. My common access card, CAC, wouldn't open it, so I circled around on foot, keeping out of sight. I found a ventilation grate in the hillside, and thanks to some adrenaline and frankly poor padlock maintenance, I pried it open. Behind it was an access tunnel, something definitely not on the base maps. By this point, my heart was pounding. I knew I was way off the reservation, but I also knew this might be the only chance to see what secret these trucks were bringing in under cover of darkness. Crawling through that utility tunnel was claustrophobic. I passed large electrical cables and pipes, heading in the general direction the trucks went. After maybe 50 yards, I started hearing the hum of machinery and muffled voices. Eventually, I dropped down behind some kind of steel bulkhead door. It was slightly ajar. Perhaps the maintenance crew left it unsecured while dealing with the convoy. I slipped inside and found myself in a brightly lit underground corridor. This was no ordinary basement. The corridor stretched out and then opened into multiple levels. I realized I was looking at a subterranean facility built deep under Fort Knox. Later, I would estimate I was perhaps 3 or 4 stories underground. The architecture had the sterile look of a high-tech bunker. White walls, reinforced bulkheads, and doors with electronic keypads and biometric scanners at every intersection. I remember an emergency sign on the wall that read, Level 3B Containment, which sent a chill down my spine. Containment of what? I ducked into a recessed doorway as a pair of personnel walked by. They weren't dressed like any soldiers or treasury police I know. One was in a lab coat carrying a tablet, and the other wore tactical gear, but with no unit patch or insignia. Definitely not regular army uniform. They passed speaking in low tones. I caught a snippet. Chimera trial. Schedule. Phase 2. That word chimera hit me hard. I instantly thought of human-animal hybrids. I've heard the term in sci-fi and fringe discussions, but here it was, spoken in a matter-of-fact way in a secret tunnel under Fort Knox. Once they were gone, I moved deeper in. I passed what looked like a small security station, monitors showing camera feeds. So yes, I was probably on some of those cameras. I was damn lucky, or they were distracted. There were indeed armed guards in black tactical outfits at certain doors. I realized this operation had its own security force, separate from us surface MPs. They didn't expect any regular soldier to be down here, which worked to my advantage at that moment. As I carefully proceeded, I came upon a large room that made my breath catch in my throat. It was some sort of laboratory or observation chamber. I stayed in the shadows of an observation window and peered inside. What I saw is burned into my memory. 3 containment pods or cells, each about the size of a small garage, with reinforced glass walls. Inside those, things were moving. In one cell, I saw what looked like a person, but hunched over and with patches of fur on his arms and back. It was shackled by the wrists to the wall. In the dim light, I could see an elongated face, almost wolf-like, though he still had human features. In the next cell, there was a smaller figure, maybe the size of a child, but it had an oversized head and large black eyes, almost like some kind of humanoid goat, or maybe even a primate. It was curled in a corner, and as it shifted, I caught a glance of slender limbs and something like hooves where feet should be. The third cell was dark, power save mode perhaps, but I swear I heard a low growl emanating from it, a sound that no normal human throat could produce. I'm no scientist, but it was obvious these were experimental test subjects, human-animal hybrids. My stomach lurched. The combination of horror and fascination had me rooted in place. My mind raced. How is this possible? Who authorized this? I thought of those documented experiments overseas, like when Chinese military scientists spliced genes from tardigrades, water bears, into human cells to make soldiers more radiation resistant. That's real. It was in the news. And there are old Soviet rumors of trying to create human-ape hybrids in the 1920s. I always dismissed those as myth. Yet here I was, looking at living beings that seemed to be grotesque mixes of Homo sapiens with something else. It's like the worst sci-fi ideas come to life. I forced myself to move on before I was discovered. I slipped past that lab and found a small office or records room, thankfully empty. My heart was thudding so loudly I was sure I'd get caught, but the area was strangely quiet. In hindsight, this might have been a shift change lull, or they were occupied unloading whatever the trucks brought. I got lucky. On a desk, a document was open. I skimmed and caught references to Project Nomad and Hybrid Soldier Program. There were technical phrases about gene sequencing, viral vectors, and augmented regeneration in Subject 11, feline. It hit me that they might be blending human DNA with various animal DNA to cherry-pick traits. Feline for night vision and agility, lupine, wolf, for strength endurance, primate for intelligence maybe. Creating some kind of super soldier chimera, or several versions of them. An ethical nightmare, to put it mildly. At that moment, an alarm started blaring. Not a loud intrusion alarm, but a muted klaxon and a yellow warning light flashing in the corridor. Possibly a containment breach drill, or something related to one of the test subjects. I decided that was my cue to get out. I retraced my steps, trying to stay calm as I jogged back to the maintenance tunnel. I passed one panicked-looking technician, but before he could register that I didn't belong, I ducked into the dark utility shaft. I replaced the grate behind me and disappeared into the night before anyone was the wiser. Back in my barracks bunk an hour later, I sat in the dark, shaking. It was overwhelming. I had just infiltrated what appears to be a top-secret experimental lab beneath Fort Knox. They are doing things that violate the laws of nature, and almost certainly a dozen federal laws and international conventions. My mind reeled thinking about the security. If this got out, it would be a scandal of historic proportions. And I realized, maybe this is why Fort Knox is so heavily guarded and mythologized. It's not just about gold. The gold, whether it's there or not, could be a cover story. No one would think to look for a biotech black site under the bullion vault. The next few days were nerve-wracking. I expected at any moment to be grabbed by CID or some ominous men in black for trespassing in their secret, but nothing obvious happened. However, I did notice changes. The base commander made a surprise announcement that a certain training area near the vault would be off-limits due to a scheduled exercise. An exercise no one had heard about. They increased surface patrols in that sector. Maybe they found my footprints or the jimmied grate. I kept my head down, acting none the wiser. I did start discreetly asking around if anyone had heard of Nomad or seen odd secure data lines. No one admitted to knowing anything. My chain of command can't be trusted. Whoever runs this operation seems to have high-level support, and the secrecy is intense. It's an open secret that Fort Knox has secrets. Plenty of people question why so few audits are allowed, and spin theories about fake gold or hidden treasures. But human-animal hybrid experiments, I would have laughed at that notion last week. Now I've seen it with my own eyes. Here's what I can deduce about the facility, in case anything happens to me, and these notes need to make sense to others. Location: directly beneath or adjacent to the bullion depository, possibly extending under the vault itself. Structure: at least 4 underground levels. I saw level 3B. Likely built deep enough to avoid detection, maybe shielded against satellite or seismic observation. Each level seems to have a distinct function: containment, R&D, etc. Security measures: biometric scanners, CCTV, possibly an automated failsafe if containment is breached. Guards in black tactical gear with no insignia, likely shoot-to-kill orders for intruders. Personnel: a mix of unidentified military or private contractors, plus scientists with specialized roles. Unmarked lab coats, no obvious corporate logos. Cover story: any anomalies are explained as vault maintenance or other routine operations. The gold vault itself is the perfect front. Nobody questions extreme security there, and no one expects an underground lab. I am a soldier who follows orders, but this feels grossly unethical. These creatures are imprisoned for unknown purposes. If a leak or escape occurs, it could be catastrophic. The entire secrecy protocol suggests a special access program with extremely limited oversight. It may very well be unstoppable without external intervention. I haven't decided on my next move. Gathering evidence is risky, but silence feels complicit. I did manage to keep a small key card found in that records room, labeled LL3 Serpent. I have no idea what Serpent signifies. Maybe a project code name or a lab section. It's the only hard proof I possess, but I don't dare try it on any base systems. I'm writing this as an insurance policy. If I vanish or have an accident, someone needs to know why. My only request is to handle this information carefully. There are powerful entities involved, and they won't hesitate to eliminate threats to their program. If no updates from me arrive in a few weeks, assume the worst and pass this information to whatever trusted outlets you can. I've been wrestling with whether I should send this or just keep it to myself, but it's been weighing on me for a while, and I figure it's time I lay it all out. I was working on a road construction project for the Central 70 overhaul in Denver, Colorado, back in the summer of 2021. We were pushing through a night shift under a pretty tight schedule. There'd been a lot of pressure from higher-ups to keep everything on track because of all the traffic detours and the massive backup it was causing on I-70. The entire project had a pretty tense atmosphere even before anything weird happened. Crews were constantly rotating around, and we'd hear all sorts of rumors about restricted areas under the city. Most of us just assumed it was typical construction gossip, like how there's always talk about hidden tunnels or abandoned fallout shelters from the Cold War era. I guess that's a real thing in places like Washington, D.C., or even parts of Los Angeles, so I didn't think much of it. We had been assigned to a section near the old Purina factory, which is close to where I-70 arches above Brighton Boulevard. It was late, maybe 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when our machinery started acting up. The bulldozer on site was giving us some trouble with its hydraulic system, So my coworker, who's more mechanically inclined, started fiddling with it. Things got quiet for a moment, and I ended up wandering a few hundred feet from our main station because I noticed something odd about one of the side tunnels they had drilled for utility lines. I'd never been in that area after dark, and all I had was the beam of my handheld flashlight. The tunnel was marked off limits with one of those flimsy plastic orange fences, but it was partially collapsed on one side. There was also a battered authorized personnel only sign in Spanish and English, which I assumed was for the city's inspection crews. I squatted down to look inside and noticed that there wasn't much of a floor, just rough concrete and rebar, but it looked deeper than I expected. It was like the floor dropped off into a natural cavern, nearly a 15 or 20 foot drop from the lip of the tunnel. That was unusual because we'd mostly been working in straightforward man-made corridors. I remembered reading about how parts of this area can open into old drainage systems, or even old mine shafts, so I wasn't completely shocked. But the angle and the size of what I saw didn't feel like a typical drainage canal. It was more like a large cave-like chamber that had been artificially expanded. I was about to turn back when I heard something that sounded like scraping against concrete. I killed my flashlight for a second to avoid drawing attention to myself, even though I wasn't sure who or what I was hiding from. In the darkness, I heard movement from inside the chamber. It was this low, almost wet-sounding shuffle, like something walking on 2 feet but dragging its tail, or maybe something else behind it. I suddenly thought about the stories I'd heard from old-timers who joked about underground lizard people whenever new tunnels were discovered. Back then, I always rolled my eyes at that stuff. I stayed crouched there, and that's when I saw 2 figures. The light wasn't great, just a faint glow from some overhead floodlights reflecting off the wet interior, but I could see them moving around down there. They had a shape similar to humans, but were definitely not people in any standard sense. The skin looked scaled in the glimpses I caught, and their arms seemed disproportionately long, like they could almost touch the ground even while upright. One of them appeared to carry some kind of dark, elongated bag or object, but I couldn't tell exactly what it was. They seemed to communicate with these low hissing sounds and guttural clicks, turning their heads sharply as if scanning the space. I remember thinking my eyes had to be playing tricks on me, so I reached for my phone to see if I could get a short video. That's when I heard the voice of another worker who was wandering by, calling out quietly to see if I was around. He never actually saw them. He was just looking for me. I partially turned to see where he was, and by the time I turned my head back, the 2 figures were moving deeper into the darkness on the far side of that cavern opening. I still had a chance to watch them for maybe 3 or 4 seconds as they walked away. They moved quickly and smoothly, in a hunched posture, and they seemed to know their way around the uneven floor very well. I ended up telling my coworker I needed him to help check something near this collapsed section. He followed me there, but it was quiet again, and at that point, I think I just sounded paranoid. I told him I thought I saw homeless people, or maybe even a couple of thieves creeping around. He shrugged and said, if we saw them again, we should call in the site supervisor. He didn't notice my panic. I guess he just assumed I was uneasy because of the darkness. We left it at that. Later that night, someone from the project's oversight team, who had a tie-in with the Colorado Department of Transportation, came through. Another worker casually mentioned to this person that I thought we saw some people trespassing. That got me pulled aside almost immediately. The representative was oddly serious, asking what I saw, how tall they were, what they were wearing, and if they said anything. I tried to explain that we mostly just heard the movement and maybe saw a silhouette. I kept the weirder details to myself, which is something I still regret. The official said I should avoid exploring off-limit sections, especially at night, because conditions were unstable and that my safety was a priority. But the way they said it felt like they were more concerned about being discovered than about my actual well-being. Then the following week, that entire area was sealed off. Concrete barriers were poured up so quickly, it felt like they'd been planning it for a while. We were told that structural instability forced them to close that portion of the site indefinitely. But even guys who had been around the area for days prior said they never noticed any major structural issues. No cracks or anything unusual. It was all very sudden. I found it especially strange that one of the roving security guards, who usually just fraternized with our crew when bored, became very tight-lipped. He stopped chatting about random sports scores and started patrolling that newly sealed area more frequently, although from a distance. One night, a coworker overheard the guard reporting on his radio that everything was clear, and there was a distinct edge of fear in his voice. The next morning, a fresh layer of chain-link fencing went up, and additional floodlights were positioned so no one could approach without being illuminated from a distance. I've done construction work in various states for more than a decade, and I have never seen that level of security for what was supposedly just a structure collapse risk. Normally, you just rope the area off, put up some signage, and carry on with the rest of your duties. Here, it felt more like someone wanted to bury the entire section, both figuratively and literally. One aspect that still bugs me is the odd item one of those things was carrying. It was shaped like a long case or bag, but it had a slight glint to it, like metal or some kind of reflective fabric. I've wondered about that more times than I can count. Could it have been equipment, something they salvaged from earlier work, or something else entirely? I even tried doing some research on local geology and discovered that parts of Denver do have old mine shafts running below them, especially toward the foothills and around Golden. But in the immediate area under I-70, I couldn't find any record of official tunnels going that deep. There are storm drains, sure, and some older ones from the 60s and 70s that have been decommissioned, but nothing that would account for the large natural cavern I saw, unless there's something not in the public record, which is entirely possible. I haven't been sleeping too well since. On one hand, I want to brush it off as an overactive imagination, but on the other, I know I saw something physically standing there in that half-floodlit space. My flashlight was off at the time, so the light was only from the overheads. There was no chance it was a reflection or a trick of the eyes, and I absolutely remember the way those shapes looked and moved. I still get chills recalling the scale pattern on what I could see of their arms. I've thought about whether it was some kind of advanced camouflage or hazmat suits, or anything that could logically explain it away, but none of it fits. The more I try to piece it all together in my head, the more it starts spiraling into all sorts of questions I can't quite answer, and I apologize if this comes across as rambling. As you know, I do marine biology work primarily around the Ernest Sound area, southeast of Wrangell, Alaska, though I occasionally travel further up toward Yakutat Bay, depending on the research season and the species I'm studying. A few weeks ago, I was in a stretch of mostly uninhabited shoreline, not too far from Dry Bay near the Outer Banks of the Alsek River. I had just finished with some routine tide pool surveys and was making my rounds near the upper beach zone when I nearly stumbled into a set of prints that made absolutely no sense to me. I've been in some pretty remote locations up here where you might only see a few scattered brown bear tracks or the occasional moose track on softer ground, but these prints were different in both shape and stride length. At first glance from a distance, I assumed it was some half-washed-out set of overlapping footprints that maybe a few people had made. Then I came closer and realized they were clearly distinct impressions left by something with a very large foot, maybe well over 15 inches in length. The spacing between each print was also unusual. It was a longer gait than I can replicate, and I'm just over 6 feet tall. I wanted to measure and photograph them properly, but I only had my phone at the time. I had a small measuring tape in my vest, so I used that as best I could to gauge the length, plus the distance between one track and the next. My phone camera has seen better days after I dropped it off my kayak last summer near Montague Island, so the photos came out grainy, but you can still tell how the prints appear to have a wide heel and somewhat deep toe imprints in the front. There were 5 clear toes each time, so it wasn't something with claws like a typical bear track might show. The sand was damp, so the edges were crisp, but I worried the incoming tide would wash them away soon. My initial thought was maybe it was a practical joke. Some locals might carve wooden footprints or something like that and trail along the beach, but there aren't really any communities near that area. It's sparse wilderness. I feel I should mention I saw remnants of fish bones scattered close by, which wouldn't be unusual since you get a lot of eagle activity, and even coastal wolf packs occasionally dragging remains up the beach. But I recall thinking how odd it was to see half-eaten salmon so far, above the typical high tide line. Usually scavengers do that bark-like gnawing, or carry them off entirely. On top of that, there was this impression I got, that something had settled in briefly around the driftwood logs further inland. The sand was indented in multiple spots, like there had been a heavy weight there, maybe sitting or crouching. It reminded me of the time I was tagging harbor seals near Cordova, and found a set of deep impressions in the mud that made us think a large predator had bedded down. It wouldn't necessarily stand out, except this time, it seemed as though whoever or whatever left it had almost a human-like shape to the imprint. While I was there, I kept hearing distant knocks or thuds. They echoed from the tree line behind me. Sometimes the wind can play tricks, and you might get branches cracking in the breeze. I kept trying to reassure myself it was nothing but normal forest noise, though. That ambiance definitely raised my tension. I half expected to see someone poke a head out from the Sitka spruce, or maybe a brown bear rummaging for scraps. But I never saw anything move. Leaving those footprints behind felt a little nerve-wracking, because I normally would have liked to stick around longer and investigate. But I had to head back to my small camp to secure my equipment. Nightfall comes earlier up there, especially in September. I remember the color of the sky getting that deep dark purple, which usually tells me I have maybe an hour or two to pack it in, or I'll lose all light. Plus, the weather had been holding its calm for a few days, and there's always the chance it can turn rough fast around that region. I told a friend in Juneau about this over the phone a week later. She asked if there was any chance I was mixing up prints from a bear that might have slid in the sand, or maybe an odd deformation in the footprints themselves. But I'm used to identifying bear tracks, especially brown bear and black bear. This was something else. The shape and proportion were just not consistent with an ursine foot, especially with the distinct 5-toe alignment and lack of claw marks. I was also struck by how uniform the left and right prints were. I don't know any local sign that matches. My friend had heard secondhand stories of people coming across human-like tracks out in the middle of nowhere up near the Copper River Delta. We started wondering if these are from some undiscovered species, or some relic population of giant hominids, or maybe it's all a strange fluke of nature. I'll be candid that the entire time I took note of what I found, I was uneasy in a way that's hard to explain. I've cross-referenced a lot of known wildlife footprints, and even those of large indigenous mammals like moose caribou or bear. This was none of those. Possibly something that walks upright. I don't want to jump to the obvious guess because I've never been one to chase that kind of folklore, but I've also never seen anything that matched these tracks. If I get another job out that way soon, I'm planning to spend more time documenting any similar prints or signs in the area. I'd like to stake out a bit or set up some game cameras if I have the funds for a return trip. Sometimes these remote beaches change drastically between tides and storms, so the site might not look the same if I manage to get back. Regardless, I've got the grainy photos on my phone. They won't do much for anyone scientifically, but it helps me keep it fresh in my mind so I don't doubt my memory. A detail that might be relevant is that the region experienced a decent-sized quake back in 2014 that shifted some of the shoreline. So maybe new territory was exposed that never had foot traffic before. That could explain the emptiness, but it doesn't really explain the presence of those giant footprints. There is a sense up there sometimes that something is watching you, even if you don't see or hear anything definitive. I've been doing search and rescue volunteer work out here in the Kenai Peninsula for almost 8 years now, and I've gotten used to some scary situations. Frostbite on the job, near misses with wildlife, random injuries in the middle of nowhere. But I can't shake what happened about 2 weeks ago up near Resurrection Pass Trail. It started with a routine call in the late afternoon. Normally I get the notice from the local troopers or the fire department if there's a missing hiker or a possible overdue camper. This time, it was a little more urgent. Several people had reported hearing distress calls off the trail, but the local day hikers who tried to track it down said it never seemed to lead them anywhere concrete. They'd follow the sound of someone calling out that they were injured or lost. But after 30 minutes or so, the voices would abruptly switch location, sometimes behind them. That alone was strange, but I've heard echoes do wild things in these mountains, especially with the wind bouncing off ridges. Anyway, I got on my gear, extra layering, flashlight, handheld GPS, the works, and drove my old pickup up to the Cooper Landing side to start from the southern trailhead. I remember distinctly that the temperature was hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but forecasts said to expect a drop once darkness came. My biggest worry at that point was that maybe there was an actual injured person out there, and we'd be dealing with potential hypothermia. We usually find missing folks on or near the main path, because once you realize you're lost, the best move is to stay put or head downhill. But the folks who called it in said the voice didn't sound like it was moving logically. It would go from one side of the trail to another in an unnerving way. I dug into the trail registry when I first arrived, just to see if there were any suspicious short entries. People often scribble a rush note if they're heading into uncharted areas, or sometimes not at all. But I saw a couple of lines referencing strange calls and odd silhouettes. One group wrote that they cut their trek short because a shape kept flitting between trees near mile 5. They didn't describe it like a bear or moose. They said it was too slender. I remember flipping back a few pages to see if anyone else had mentioned something similar, and I found one mention from the week prior about hearing heavy breathing from the tree line after sunset. At that point, I radioed dispatch to let them know I was heading out. The plan was to go up about 3 miles in, scan around, then coordinate with the troopers in case we needed more advanced gear or a bigger team. The trail started out normal enough, quiet, cold, but about an hour in, I got that weird hairs up on my neck sensation. I kept hearing faint rustling in the brush off to my right, but every time I panned my flashlight, I'd see nothing but spruce and tall standing dead trees. Startled a ptarmigan once, it flew up in my face, nearly gave me a heart attack. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the silence that followed, like the entire forest was on pause. About half a mile ahead, I started hearing what could only be described as someone calling my name. Not my full name, but a shorter nickname that only close friends or certain coworkers use. I know that sounds crazy, but it was distinct enough in pitch that I stopped dead in my tracks. I found myself rationalizing. Maybe one of the local search and rescue guys had come out behind me and was looking for me. But I didn't recall telling anyone exactly when I'd headed in, just dispatch. Normally they'd do a check-in call on the radio, not call my nickname out loud if they were looking for me. And here's the kicker. The voice then shifted in tone, like an echo, and sounded like it was coming from ahead of me. I stood there for a good minute, scanning. No movement, no footprints in the fresh snow. I couldn't figure out how anybody would have gotten in front of me without crossing paths. But I decided to push forward, because if someone was playing a prank, it was a really ill-advised and dangerous one. At some point, I found myself near an offshoot that's not frequently used. People sometimes call it a locals-only trail, though it's not official. Just a narrower path that leads toward the slopes above Juneau Creek. That's where the voice got louder. I'd been sweeping my flashlight beam left and right, and I swear I saw, well, I don't even know how to phrase it right. It looked like a tall, lanky figure. I'm talking maybe 6.5 feet tall, but impossibly slender limbs. I never got a clear look at anything like a face or clothing. It was almost like it blurred when my light hit it, if that makes sense. Sort of advanced away from me, deeper into the brush, and that's when the calling for help started, like the typical, "Please, I'm hurt." But it wasn't said in a normal concern or panic. It was clipped and unnatural sounding. Now I've heard talk from some of the local communities, especially around the more remote interior areas, about shape-shifting entities, or what some might call skinwalkers, creatures that can mimic voices or forms to lure you away from safety. I never put much stock in that. I figured it was more of a southwestern Navajo tradition, and not something our local tribal nations typically mention. Occasionally you'll hear about the Kushtaka of Tlingit lore, the Otter people, but that's a bit different. Still, The stories sometimes overlap in the sense that these beings lure people away with illusions. Anyway, after hearing that weird call, I radioed again to see if any ground teams had come in behind me. No one responded. I was the only one out there, according to dispatch, and I was definitely the only one heading up from the southern entrance. I continued another half-mile or so, following these broken tree branches and footprints that seemed humanoid but off. That's when I started seeing more of those footprints, but they weren't consistent. The stride was too long in some places, like it would step 5 feet in a single pace, but in other spots, the spacing was normal. The shape of the prints, they almost seemed like a barefoot print but elongated toes, or maybe just partially melted. Hard to say because I was shining my light at them in the dark. I was trying to keep calm, but the air felt oppressive, and it smelled musty, kind of like rotting bark or wet fur. Definitely not typical for a crisp winter night. The next thing, I heard the voice again, but it was behind me now, closer to the main trail, and it was repeating that same thing. "I'm hurt. Help me." The hair on the back of my neck stood up because it was the exact same tone and inflection as before. No variation, like a recording. I turned around and started heading back, figuring if I was dealing with something beyond my experience, I'd at least keep it in sight. But everything was just silent, dead silent, not even a breeze. That's unusual, because near the Seward area, you almost always have some kind of wind funneling in off the water, or down from the mountains. Finally, I made the decision to extricate myself from the area. Not the bravest stance, I know, but I was alone, at night, with minimal backup. My instincts were screaming at me that something was very wrong. I kept hearing in my head what my fellow rescue partner once told me about seeing an unexplainable figure near Lost Lake Trail last winter. He'd said it walked in a distorted way, like it was injured, but the tracks it left were all over the place. He'd also said it imitated a past volunteer's voice almost perfectly, and that volunteer had died on the job years back. That story always seemed far-fetched to me. Now I was connecting the dots in my own experiences. I guess you'd call it a skinwalker or shapeshifter. I don't know enough about the specific lore to label it accurately, but that's the direction my mind went. As I was trotting back, with a healthy dose of adrenaline I might add, I heard in the distance what sounded like laughter, but so faint and airy. It wasn't a person's laugh. It was like someone trying to mimic the idea of a laugh, but not quite grasping the emotion behind it. That about sealed the deal for me. I didn't look back. I just hustled out to the trailhead, double-checked behind my pickup to make sure no footprints came close to the parking area. Then I peeled out of there. The troopers ended up sending a small team out the next morning. They found no signs of a missing hiker, no equipment left behind, nothing. A few broken branches near the trail offshoot, but they chalked it up to moose or bear. I didn't press them on it, because I know that official channels don't usually have a box on their forms for shape-shifting forest entities. But I'm telling you, I've never felt such a predatory aura in all my years up here. The weirdest part is that multiple day hikers reported hearing those calls. You'd think if it were a wild animal, they'd describe typical animal noises. But several folks specifically said it sounded like a female voice calling for help, and it led them away from the main path. Some even said the voice changed to a child's voice at one point. Now, I'm not a superstitious person. I've slept alone in cabins miles away from civilization. I've traveled across the Kenai River in the middle of the night, and I've spent more winter nights at the edge of Denali than I can count. None of that ever spooked me. But this situation has me rethinking how I approach rescue calls that involve voices leading people astray. There's a good chance it's some phenomenon we can't fully explain, or maybe it's older than any of our labels. The next time I go out on a mission like this, I'm bringing a partner no matter how short the search is supposed to be.